Have you ever wondered why some of the most successful people in the world choose solitude over companionship? Why they find more fulfillment in their own company than in the chaos of relationships? Today, we're going to explore a truth that might challenge everything you've been told about happiness and fulfillment. It's about discovering the profound peace that comes from living alone, and why this choice isn't about giving up on love, but about finding something even more valuable: complete harmony with yourself. Here's what might surprise you. The people who seem most at peace, most grounded, most genuinely content, aren't necessarily those with the perfect relationships. They're often the ones who've learned to create a life so rich and meaningful that they don't need anyone else to complete it. They've discovered that the most important relationship you'll ever have is the one with yourself. Now, before you think this is about becoming a hermit or shutting out the world, let me be clear. This is about choice. It's about reaching a place where you're with someone because you want to be, not because you need to be. There's a world of difference between those two positions, and that difference determines whether you live in freedom or in quiet desperation. The hidden cost of settling for less. Let me tell you about Margaret Thompson, a 72-year-old from Charleston, South Carolina, for 46 years. She was married to a man who never truly saw her. Every morning, she'd wake up feeling invisible in her own home. She'd prepare his breakfast, listen to his complaints about work, clean up after his mess. All while a part of her soul withered away. Margaret stayed because that's what women of her generation were taught to do. You make it work. You stick it out. You find happiness in sacrifice. But here's what nobody told her, what nobody tells any of us. Sometimes the greatest act of love you can perform is loving yourself enough to walk away from what diminishes you. When Margaret finally chose to live alone at 68, after her husband passed away, something remarkable happened. For the first time in decades, she woke up without that familiar knot in her stomach. The silence in her house wasn't empty. It was full of possibilities, full of peace, full of her own thoughts. Finally given space to breathe. This is what most people don't understand about living alone. It's not about isolation. It's about liberation when you're not constantly managing someone else's emotions, walking on eggshells around their moods, or compromising your dreams for their comfort. You discover something profound. You actually like your own company. Think about the last time you were truly alone. I mean completely alone. For more than a few hours. Were you restless, anxious, reaching for your phone to fill the silence? Or did you find a kind of peace you'd almost forgotten existed? If it was the latter, you've tasted something that millions of people spend their entire lives searching for in all the wrong places. The myth of needing someone to complete you. Society has sold us a dangerous lie that we need another person to be whole. Movies, songs, books. They all push this narrative that true happiness comes from finding your other half. But here's the truth that took me years to understand. If you're only half a person, what are you bringing to any relationship? Consider James Miller, a retired engineer from Denver, Colorado. He spent 35 years in what he calls a relationship of mutual convenience. He and his wife stayed together not because they brought out the best in each other, but because they were afraid of being alone. They'd lost the ability to enjoy their own company, so they clung to each other like two people drowning, each hoping the other would keep them afloat. When James finally chose to live alone after their divorce at 64, he discovered something that changed his entire perspective on life. He wasn't incomplete without a partner. He had simply forgotten how to be complete on his own. He started taking long walks without having to consult anyone about the route. He read books that interested him without judgment. He cooked the foods he enjoyed without compromise. He rediscovered the man he'd been before he'd learned to diminish himself for the sake of keeping peace. The beautiful thing about living alone is that you get to know yourself in ways that are impossible when you're constantly adapting to someone else's needs and expectations. You discover your natural rhythms. You learn what brings you joy when nobody's watching. You find out what your thoughts sound like when they're not being filtered through the lens of what someone else might think. I remember talking to Ruth Davidson, a 74-year-old artist from Portland, Oregon, who told me something that stopped me in my tracks. She said, I was married for 41 years to a good man, but I never knew what I actually thought about anything until I started living alone. I'd spent so many years saying we think that I'd lost track of what I think meant. Ruth's story isn't unique. It's the story of millions of people who've spent decades in relationships where they gradually disappeared into the partnership. Not because their partners were necessarily bad people, but because they never learned that you can only give from a full cup, and you can only have a full cup when you know how to fill it yourself. The freedom to be authentically yourself. When you live alone, you get to wake up every single day and ask yourself one simple question: what do I want to do today? Not what do we need to do, not what would make someone else happy, not what would avoid conflict or meet expectations. Just what do you want to do? This might seem like a small thing, but it's revolutionary for people who've spent years, even decades, automatically considering someone else's needs before their own. It's the difference between living your life and living a life that happens to have your name on it. Take Robert Chen, a 70-year-old former teacher from San Francisco, California. He told me that for the first 6 months after choosing to live alone, he felt guilty every time he made a decision without consulting someone. He'd reach for the phone to ask permission to buy a new book, to choose what to have for dinner, to decide how to spend his weekend. Then he realized what he was doing, and the absurdity of it hit him. I was asking permission to live my own life. Robert said, I'd trained myself so well to consider someone else's opinion that I'd forgotten I had the right to have my own preferences. Living alone teaches you that your preferences matter, your comfort matters, your peace matters. And here's the beautiful part. When you're living from this place of self-respect and self-knowledge, when you're full and complete on your own, you become infinitely more attractive to potential partners. But more importantly, you become much more selective about who you allow into your space. This brings me to something crucial that most people miss. Living alone doesn't mean you're antisocial or that you've given up on human connection. It means you're choosing your connections consciously rather than desperately. You're engaging with people from a place of wanting to, not needing to, and that changes everything. The peace of making your own rules. One of the most underestimated joys of living alone is the peace that comes from not having to negotiate every aspect of your daily life. You want the house at 72 degrees, it stays at 72 degrees. You want to eat dinner at 5:30, you eat at 5:30. You want to listen to jazz while you read. Nobody's complaining about the music being too loud or the wrong genre. These might sound like trivial things, but they add up to something significant. The deep relaxation that comes from being able to follow your natural inclinations without constant compromise or conflict. It's not that compromise is always bad, but when you're compromising all the time about everything, you lose touch with what you actually want and need. Dorothy Williams, an 81-year-old from Phoenix, Arizona, put it perfectly when she told me, I didn't realize how exhausting it was to constantly manage someone else's expectations until I stopped doing it. Now I have energy for things that actually matter to me. Dorothy spent 53 years married to a man who had opinions about everything, from how the dishwasher should be loaded to what constitutes appropriate television programming. She'd learned to navigate around his preferences so automatically that she'd forgotten she had her own. When she chose to live alone after he passed, she went through what she calls a year of rediscovery. I had to relearn what I actually liked. She said, turns out, I love documentaries about nature. I prefer my coffee much stronger than I'd been making it, and I actually enjoy having plants all over the house. Something he always said made the place look cluttered. The peace Dorothy found wasn't just about coffee and plants. It was about reclaiming her right to exist as herself, fully and without apology. It was about waking up in alignment with her own energy instead of having to shift gears to match someone else's mood or expectations. If you've been considering whether living alone might be right for you, I want you to ask yourself this question. When was the last time you spent a full day doing exactly what you wanted to do, exactly how you wanted to do it, without having to consider or accommodate anyone else's needs? If you can't remember, or if the thought makes you feel guilty or selfish, you might be ready to explore the profound peace that comes from living alone. Building your support system on your terms. Here's something important to understand. Choosing to live alone doesn't mean cutting yourself off from meaningful relationships. In fact, it often means your relationships become more meaningful because they're based on choice rather than dependency or habit. When you're not relying on one person to meet all your emotional and social needs, you're free to cultivate relationships that serve different aspects of your life. You might have one friend you go to for intellectual conversations, another for outdoor adventures, and another for quiet companionship. This distributed approach to relationships often leads to deeper, more satisfying connections because each relationship gets to exist for what it genuinely offers rather than trying to be everything to everyone. Let me tell you about Frank Rodriguez, a 69-year-old from Tampa, Florida. After living alone for 8 years, he's built what he calls a constellation of connections that brings him more joy and fulfillment than his 30-year marriage ever did. He has his Tuesday morning coffee group with 3 other retirees where they discuss everything from politics to philosophy. He volunteers at the local animal shelter twice a week, which gives him a sense of purpose and connection to his community. He has a standing monthly dinner date with his sister, where they catch up on family news without the complications that used to arise from his ex-wife's complicated relationship with his family. The beautiful thing, Frank told me, is that each of these relationships gets to be what it is, nothing more and nothing less. I'm not expecting my coffee buddies to meet my need for physical affection, and I'm not expecting my sister to share my passion for politics. Everyone gets to show up as themselves, and so do I. This approach to relationships requires something that many people find challenging: emotional self-sufficiency. You have to learn to comfort yourself when you're sad, motivate yourself when you're lacking energy, and celebrate your victories even when no one else is around to witness them. But here's what's remarkable. Once you develop these skills, you discover they're not burdens, they're superpowers. The financial freedom of living alone. Let's talk about something practical that often gets overlooked in discussions about living arrangements: money. When you live alone, every financial decision is yours to make. You're not arguing about whether to spend money on a vacation or home improvements. You're not having to justify purchases or negotiate budgets with someone whose financial values might be completely different from yours. This financial autonomy can be incredibly liberating, especially for people who've spent years having to justify or hide their spending decisions. Martha Johnson, a 73-year-old from Nashville, Tennessee, told me that one of the unexpected joys of living alone was being able to spend her money on what actually mattered to her, without having to explain or defend those choices. My husband thought spending money on books was wasteful when you could get them from the library. Martha said, he couldn't understand why I wanted to own books, to be able to write in margins and revisit favorite passages. For 45 years, I felt guilty every time I bought a book. Now I have a library that brings me joy every single day. The financial peace that comes from living alone isn't just about being able to buy what you want. It's about the deeper peace of alignment between your values and your actions. When your spending reflects your actual priorities rather than compromises or accommodations, you feel more integrated and authentic. Of course, living alone does mean bearing all the household expenses yourself, which can be challenging on a fixed income. But many people find that the peace of mind and emotional well-being that comes from living alone is worth the financial trade-offs. Plus, when you're only supporting your own lifestyle, you often discover you need less than you thought. If you're interested in more content like this, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us continue creating content that explores the deeper aspects of living authentically and finding peace in our later years. The spiritual dimension of solitude. There's something profound that happens when you spend significant time alone. You start to hear yourself think, Not the constant chatter of reacting to other people's needs and emotions, but your deeper thoughts, your authentic responses to life, your genuine feelings about what's happening in the world and in your heart. This is why many spiritual traditions emphasize the importance of solitude. It's not because isolation is inherently holy, but because it's in solitude that we're most likely to encounter our authentic selves. When there's no one to perform for, no role to play, no expectations to meet, what remains is just you. In all your complexity and simplicity, consider the story of Elizabeth Parker, a 77-year-old from Sedona, Arizona, who describes her decision to live alone as a return to myself after decades of being someone else's wife. Elizabeth had been married 3 times, each marriage lasting over a decade, and she told me that she'd become so skilled at adapting to her partner's personalities that she'd lost touch with her own. Living alone forced me to figure out who I am when I'm not reflecting someone else's expectations. Elizabeth said, at first it was terrifying. I didn't know what I liked, what I believed, what brought me peace. But gradually, over months and then years, I started to recognize myself again. Elizabeth's experience points to something crucial. Living alone can be an act of self-discovery that's impossible to achieve when you're constantly in relationship mode, when you're only responsible for your own emotional state, when you're only managing your own energy. You have space to explore questions that might have been buried for decades. What brings you joy when no one's watching? What are your thoughts when they don't have to be filtered through someone else's sensibilities? What does your intuition tell you when it's not being drowned out by someone else's voice? This kind of self-knowledge isn't just intellectually interesting. It's practically valuable. When you know yourself this deeply, you make better decisions about everything from where to live, to how to spend your time, to whether someone deserves a place in your life. Addressing the fears about living alone. If you're considering living alone but feeling afraid, you're not unusual. Our culture has deep-seated fears about solitude that often have more to do with conditioning than reality. Let me address some of the most common concerns I hear from people considering this choice. The first fear is loneliness. People assume that living alone automatically means being lonely. But this isn't necessarily true. Loneliness is an emotional state, not a living arrangement. You can be profoundly lonely in a house full of people, and you can be deeply content living by yourself. The difference lies in your relationship with yourself and your conscious choices about how to connect with others. Remember James Miller from Denver? He told me that he was far lonelier during his 35-year marriage than he's ever been living alone. When you're with someone who doesn't really see you or appreciate you, that's a special kind of loneliness, he said. At least when I'm alone now, I'm in good company. The second fear is safety. This is particularly common among older adults, especially women, who worry about having emergencies with no one around to help. This is a practical concern that deserves attention, but it's also manageable with proper planning. Many people living alone create support systems that include regular check-ins with friends or family, medical alert systems, and connections with neighbors. Dorothy Williams from Phoenix addressed this by joining a buddy system with 2 other women in her apartment complex. They check in with each other every morning and evening with simple text messages. It gives me the security of knowing someone would notice if something was wrong, but without the daily compromise of sharing my space, she said. The third fear is about missing out on the companionship and intimacy that come with partnership. This is perhaps the most complex fear because it touches on deep human needs for connection and affection. But here's what many people discover. When you're truly comfortable alone, when you've built a life that fulfills you, you're in a much better position to recognize and attract healthy companionship. Take a moment and think about this. What if instead of fearing loneliness, you started to see solitude as an opportunity? What if instead of worrying about what you might miss, you started to consider what you might discover? Making the transition to living alone? If you're thinking about making the transition to living alone, whether by choice or circumstance, there are some practical steps that can help make the adjustment smoother and more rewarding. First, start small. If you're currently in a relationship or living situation that's not serving you, you don't have to make dramatic changes overnight. Begin by claiming small spaces and times that are entirely yours. Maybe it's an hour in the morning before anyone else wakes up, or a corner of a room that reflects only your taste. Start to remember what it feels like to exist without accommodation or compromise. Second, develop your self-care practices. When you live alone, you're your own primary caregiver in every sense. This means learning to comfort yourself when you're upset, motivate yourself when you're lacking energy, and celebrate your successes even when no one else is there to witness them. These aren't burdens. They're skills that will serve you whether you live alone or not. Third, cultivate a range of social connections. One of the reasons people fear living alone is the assumption that it means cutting yourself off from others. In reality, it often means building a more diverse and satisfying social life because you're choosing your connections based on what genuinely nourishes you rather than settling for whatever's convenient. I want to encourage you to share this message with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for others is to give them permission to put their own well-being first. If this resonates with you, please like this video and let me know in the comments. What's one thing you would do differently if you knew no one was watching? Final thoughts. The choice to live alone isn't about giving up on love or connection. It's about choosing to love and connect from a position of strength rather than need. It's about discovering that the most important relationship you'll ever have is the one with yourself. And that when this relationship is strong and healthy, every other relationship in your life benefits. Too many people spend their entire lives running from solitude, afraid of what they might find if they stop moving long enough to be still with themselves. But what if, instead of something to fear, solitude is something to embrace? What if the peace you're searching for in relationships with others can only be found by first making peace with yourself? Living alone teaches you that you are enough, not because you don't need others, but because you know the difference between wanting someone in your life and needing them to complete you. It's the difference between invitation and desperation, between love and codependency, between sharing your life and losing yourself in someone else's. The path to this kind of peace isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Because when you finally find the courage to be alone with yourself, really alone, you might discover that you're the person you've been looking for all along. And from that place of self-knowledge and self-acceptance, every choice you make about how to live, who to love, and what to value becomes an authentic expression of who you really are. So consider this your invitation, not to isolation, but to integration, not to loneliness, but to self-companionship, not to giving up on love, but to discovering that the greatest love story you'll ever experience might just be the one between you and the life you have the courage to create on your own terms. Before we end, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced the peace that comes from being truly alone with yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more conversations about finding authenticity and peace in our later years.